Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode in our massive series on World War II. Today, we're diving into the spring and summer of 1944. The big headlines for this period are the Battle of Sevastopol, the Allied D-Day landings in Normandy, and Operation Bagration. But on top of all that, there was, of course, a ton of other action happening across every front of the war. On May 9th, 1944, Sevastopol was liberated. We started talking about the battle for Sevastopol in our last episode. On April 23rd, the Red Army attempted to storm the city. But Sevastopol was heavily fortified, with the Germans having established a deeply layered defense. The April assault didn't pan out, so a new preparation and a major regrouping of Soviet forces began, which was completed by May 5th. This really shows you how seriously this operation was planned. Just consider this: the army commanders, and then their subordinate officers in turn, weren't given their objectives just by looking at maps. They were briefed directly on the ground, in the actual terrain, as the troops began their attempts to push into Sevastopol. It was clear the mission was being treated with the utmost seriousness, with what people at the time called the severity of wartime. He was told, "If the offensive fails on your sector, you'll be putting your party card on the table." And after that, well, the consequences could have been all sorts of things. The assault on the city began. It started with reconnaissance in force to make the Germans reveal their firing positions. Once they did, we started hammering those positions with everything we had. We hit them from the air, pounded them with artillery, and then the infantry moved in to storm the German fortifications. The general assault began on May 7th, with the main thrust focused on Sapun Ridge. The thing is, the area around Sapun Ridge, near Mezhgori, was the only place tanks could get through, and that's precisely why the heaviest fighting erupted there, all centered on that ridge. It's important to note that the Soviet troops attacked in two echelons. Here's how it worked. The first echelon would advance, and then, when it was worn down or had taken losses too heavy to keep pushing effectively, the second echelon would move in. It would be replaced by the second echelon, and frankly, the battle for Sapun Ridge was incredibly fierce. The German forces were driven out. They managed to regroup fairly quickly and launched a counterattack. But by that time, fresh Soviet units had moved up to replace the first echelon, which was, by then, exhausted and had suffered heavy casualties. The German counterattack came to nothing, and they were forced to retreat. On May 9th, the general assault continued, and Soviet troops began to cross the Sevastopol Bay. Now, as you can imagine, there was a serious shortage of landing craft. This led to a rather bizarre, if you will, episode. The German quartermasters had stockpiled a large number of coffins, and it was on these very coffins that some of the Soviet soldiers made their crossing. Of course, some crossed in boats, others on rafts, and some used these coffins to build rafts and get themselves to the other shore. The city was completely liberated on May 9th. Now, let's talk about the casualty figures. In Sevastopol alone, the Germans lost more than 20,000 men killed, with another 24,000 taken prisoner. An additional 42,000 German soldiers and officers ended up at the bottom of the sea. They drowned during their evacuation attempts after their vessels were either bombed from the air or sunk by artillery fire. The Red Army's losses in the battle for Sevastopol were about 6,000. The next day, on May 10th, Moscow honored the victory with a 324-gun salute, firing 24 volleys. Now, shifting to another front of the World War on May 24th, the Hitler line in Italy was breached. As I mentioned in previous episodes, the German defense in Italy was structured around several fortified lines. And the final, most powerful one, was called the Hitler Line. and it was breached on May 24th, 1944. There's a catch, though. By that time, it had already been renamed the Sänger Line, after one of the German generals. You see, as soon as Hitler learned that the American troops were getting closer to this final defensive line, he insisted it be renamed. His reasoning was essentially, of course they're going to break through a Hitler line. What kind of bad publicity would that be? And you know, it's quite possible Goebbels was the one who suggested it, insisting that no military defeat should ever be associated with the Führer's name. In the end, combined American, British, Canadian, and Polish corps shattered this final defensive line. With their defenses in Italy completely broken, the Allies were now poised to complete the country's full liberation. You know, when I'm preparing these episodes, one thing always strikes me. There are these critical sectors on the front lines, massive logistical operations, and complex intelligence missions. On the Eastern Front, the Germans are suffering defeat after defeat. Here, the Allies have just broken through in Italy. And yet, at this very same moment, the Germans are devoting enormous resources to something else, hunting down Yugoslav partisans, specifically their leader, Josip Broz Tito. On May 25th, the Germans launched a massive operation. Its objective was to capture Tito himself, and by doing so, decapitate the entire partisan movement in Yugoslavia. It must be said that the Germans, at the cost of heavy casualties, a large number of dead and wounded, managed to capture Dorvar, the headquarters of the Yugoslav partisan movement. They seized the radio stations, cutting the partisans off from their communications. But Tito himself escaped. The Germans failed to capture him. Thus, an operation they had spent months preparing ended up being a complete failure. June of 1944 began with Operation Frantic. This was a United States operation, and the operation was, if not frantic, then certainly strange. What was it all about? The thing is, World War II-era aircraft couldn't fly as far as modern planes, and they certainly couldn't make the return trip. So, when American bombers took off from bases in Italy to hit targets in Europe, they often couldn't make it back to Italy. They didn't have enough fuel for the return trip, and they were vulnerable to being shot down along the way. So, the Americans struck a deal with the Soviet Union. The plan was this: American bombers would take off from bases in Italy, hit targets in Nazi-occupied Europe, but instead of turning back, they would continue eastward to land on Soviet territory. They would refuel, rearm, and then, for their next mission, they would fly Soviet-assigned sorties, bombing German targets at the Soviets' direction. After that, they would finally make the return flight back to their bases in Italy. It was a logistically insane plan, even by the standards of the time. Nevertheless, the Soviet Union agreed. Yes, they said, let's do it. 3 American airfields were established in the Poltava region of Ukraine. Honestly, I'd never even heard about this until I was preparing this episode. The Americans even sent a military contingent of 1,300 personnel there. So, what actually happened over the 4 months they used these bases? The Americans conducted 7 major operations, striking 24 key targets in German-held territory. This shuttle bombing technique, as they called it, did complicate things for German air defenses. The bombers would come from one direction, Italy, and then disappear to the east, only to reappear later from the Soviet Union. The Germans were certainly confused by it. But to be honest, the overall strategic impact was minimal. In fact, in June 1944, the Soviet air defense tasked with protecting these very American bases failed to stop a major German air raid. The attack destroyed the majority of the heavy bombers on the ground. What followed was the Warsaw Uprising. The Americans, and especially the British, pleaded, "Let us use our aircraft to support the uprising." allow our planes to take off from Soviet airfields to deliver supplies to Warsaw. The Soviet command refused, saying, "No, we will not permit this." So, long story short, in August of 1944, this cooperation was suspended and later ended completely. On June 4, 1944, the Allies liberated Rome. All this time, a crucial intelligence operation was unfolding in Italy. As I told you in a previous episode, the Allies had struck a deal with Stalin to have Soviet forces simulate major military activity, threatening an amphibious landing in Norway to make the Germans believe a second front would open there. Rome was liberated, of course, as part of the overall military plan. But simultaneously, in Italy, the Allies were doing everything possible to make Hitler believe one of two things. Either a massive invasion force was about to hit the French Riviera, or the Allied troops were going to push through the Balkans instead. Either way, this deception forced Hitler to keep significant forces tied down in both of those areas. On top of everything else, there were a great number of diversionary operations. The entire coast of England was littered with inflatable tanks, inflatable landing barges, and fake artillery emplacements. Furthermore, intelligence agents, who had been turned by the British to act as double agents, were feeding the Abwehr information that the British and American landing would definitely occur in June around Pas de Calais. That's the narrowest point of the channel separating France and England. The message was, the landing will be here at Pas de Calais, and Normandy isn't even on the table. And it worked. The Germans guarded the Pas de Calais coast and kept their main force there. The goal of the British deception campaign was precisely to keep the bulk of the German army tied up around Pas de Calais for as long as possible, ideally for 2 weeks, which is exactly what they achieved, so the Germans wouldn't even think about Normandy. And on June 6th, Operation Overlord began, the Allied landing in Normandy. To put it simply, it remains the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The overall plan for the Normandy landing was largely prepared by British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. There are many famous stories, even legends about Montgomery, but his persona was specifically used during the spy games surrounding the operation. Since the Germans knew Montgomery was the mastermind behind any potential invasion, it was logical for them to assume that wherever he was, that's where the main Allied thrust would come from. That would be where they were preparing their bases, and from where they would launch their offensive. So, what does British intelligence do? They hire an actor named Clifton James. Take a look at him. He's a dead ringer for Montgomery. They dress him up as the field marshal and ship him off to Algeria with orders to be seen in public places. The goal is for German agents to spot him and report back to Berlin. Montgomery is in Algeria. That means they're building up a large force group here. They're probably heading for Greece, or will launch an invasion of the Balkans directly. Of course, Clifton James was a massive headache for British intelligence. The real Field Marshal Montgomery didn't drink or smoke. Clifton James, on the other hand, was a heavy drinker and a chain smoker. He kept falling out of character. You have to understand, it's hard for a man who drinks 4 days out of the work week to suddenly play the part of the stoic Field Marshal Montgomery. And under the blazing Algerian sun, no less. You can imagine the handlers thinking, what the hell kind of intelligence operation is this? Who knows? Nobody can say for sure how much the Germans actually bought it. Nevertheless, this operation happened, and it was carried out right before the invasion. All right, let's talk about D-Day itself. You've seen it in hundreds of movies and documentaries. But one of the most important films, which probably everyone has seen, is Saving Private Ryan. It captured that insane landing, that almost inhuman courage of American and British soldiers crawling across open beaches under relentless fire from those pillboxes. But let's quickly cover the operation as a whole, because it was a true milestone in military science. On the night of June 5th, the airborne operations began. The first major operation was Operation Tonga, where British airborne troops were landed behind the German coastal defense lines using gliders. All right, let's talk about D-Day itself. You've seen it in hundreds of movies and documentaries. But one of the most important films, which probably everyone has seen, is Saving Private Ryan. It captured that insane landing, that almost inhuman courage of American and British soldiers crawling across open beaches under relentless fire from those pillboxes. But let's quickly cover the operation as a whole, because it was a true milestone in military science. On the night of June 5th, the airborne operations began. The first major operation was Operation Tonga, where British airborne troops were landed behind the German coastal defense lines using gliders. Then, on the morning of June 6th, the amphibious landings began. Here's a crucial point to remember. They had none of the specialized equipment we have today. No amphibious tanks, no complex pontoon bridges, no massive landing ships. And most importantly, there was nowhere to dock. If you look at photos of the Normandy beaches, all those sectors they were divided into, you'll see there are no natural harbors. There was simply nowhere to pull a ship up to a pier. This presented the central problem. How do you land tanks? How do you land artillery? How do you land all the other essential supplies? Just to give you a sense of the scale, over the course of the entire operation, more than 2.5 million men were landed on the shores of Normandy. Not on the first day, of course, but in total. They also delivered about 500,000 vehicles and over 4 million tons of supplies. The British came up with an absolutely brilliant solution: the Mulberry Harbors. Look them up. You can see what they looked like. Parts of them are still there today, jutting out of the water at the landing sites, never recovered. These floating harbors were constructed partly from old ships that were deliberately sunk to form breakwaters, and partly from enormous interconnected iron caissons that were welded on shore in England and then towed all the way across the English Channel. They were assembled on site, and these artificial harbors then allowed larger supply ships to dock and unload. It was a unique feat of military engineering. The second major challenge was fuel. Think about it. The Army has landed, but it needs to keep moving forward. It can't possibly bring all its fuel with it. The solution was to run pipelines right across the bottom of the English Channel. Estimates vary. Some sources say several dozen, others about a dozen. But these underwater fuel lines were laid. Through these pipelines, fuel was pumped directly from England to the French coast, which was then used to refuel the tanks and all the other vehicles. On the morning of June 6th, the seaborne landings commenced. I've actually been to that very site, and those German pillboxes are absolutely astonishing constructions. If you look at photos of how they look today, they are, for the most part, catastrophically intact. They were built, as they say, to last for centuries. You can see hits from artillery shells and bomb craters, but overall, these structures have survived. So, that morning, the bombardment came first. Then the British warships opened up with their naval guns, and only after that did the landing begin. The landing was hampered by fog. The weather was a major problem in general. The operation was supposed to have started a day earlier, and even a week earlier. But there were storms, and there was no way to bring the ships in safely. And so the landings began. Overall, the Allied Air Force and naval artillery had performed well on almost all sectors, except for one: Omaha Beach. All those harrowing images of bodies in the water, of the surf stained with human blood, that was Omaha Beach. It was there that the Americans lost 1,700 men killed and another 3,000 wounded in a single morning. The reason was a catastrophic failure in the landing plan. They landed in the wrong spot, and the preparatory bombing runs by aircraft and the naval bombardment had missed their marks. The German defenders were largely untouched and, as a result, were able to cut them down. To understand why, you have to look at how the defenses were set up. The beach was a death trap, razor wire that had to be cut with shears, dense lines of Czech hedgehogs that needed to be blown up, and then the soldiers had to scramble for cover on the rocky shore because they somehow had to get up the bluffs and capture the German coastal defenses. In short, what happened at Omaha Beach was a catastrophe. On the other American beaches, however, things went more or less according to plan. Though according to plan is a relative term, we must give credit where it's due to our allies. This was an operation of unparalleled courage. On June 6th, the first wave landed 156,000 American, British, and Canadian soldiers on the coast of France. They brought 10,000 vehicles and pieces of equipment with them. By the end of D-Day, the Allies had secured 3 beachheads and had landed an additional 5 infantry divisions and 3 armored brigades from the sea. It's crucial to emphasize that all this time, the German High Command was convinced this was a diversion. They were still waiting for the main attack at the Pas de Calais. So, the German reserves didn't move. Those few days of delay would cost them Normandy, and ultimately, all of France, because by the end of the month, Paris would be liberated. That hesitation was truly fatal for the Germans. By June 12th, the Allies had consolidated a single, solid beachhead 80 kilometers wide and 17 kilometers deep. The German command had by then committed up to 12 divisions to the fight, but it was impossible to dislodge the Allies. By the end of June, the Allies had expanded their beachhead to 100 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep. On June 18th, troops from the U.S. 7th Corps of the First Army cut off and isolated German forces on the Cotentin Peninsula. This move effectively locked the Germans in all their ports, from Brest to Cherbourg and Saint-Lô. On June 29th, the Allies captured the main strategic objective of this phase, the deep-water port of Cherbourg. Now they could bring in large ships, even though the Germans had thoroughly destroyed the harbor facilities. Nevertheless, it would become a vital logistical artery. To understand the importance of a deep-water port and of logistics in general for this operation, consider the statistics. For every soldier in the expeditionary force, there were roughly 10 tons of various equipment. On top of that, they needed an additional 1 ton of supplies per soldier for every 30 days of the operation. The range of supply items, or SKUs as you'd say in a supermarket, came to about 1 million distinct articles. So, with Cherbourg in Allied hands, the logistical side of the operation undoubtedly gained momentum. Almost synchronously with the Normandy campaign, on June 10th, the Viborg offensive began on the Soviet, or as the Germans called it, the Eastern Front. On the morning of June 9th, Soviet aviation launched a massive strike against defensive positions held primarily by Finnish units, along with German forces. This began a methodical destruction of the enemy's strong points. Artillery barrages and aerial bombardments continued without pause for 10 hours. In the early morning of June 10th, the forces of the 21st Army went on the offensive. What followed for the Finns was a catastrophe. In just 10 days of fighting, Soviet troops breached all 3 defensive lines, including the heavily reinforced Mannerheim Line, which the Finns had restored after the Winter War. The operation concluded on June 20th with the capture of Viborg, which the Finns barely defended, focusing instead on attempts to mine it. Red Army losses were approximately 30,000 men. Finnish losses were 32,000. Then, on June 22nd, an interesting development occurred. Finland, through the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, sent a peace feeler to the Soviet Union. The Soviet government responded by demanding an unconditional surrender. The Finns refused to sign it, despite having already been defeated on the Karelian Isthmus. The fighting continued. The Finns were not yet ready to accept surrender at that point. However, peace negotiations, conducted through the Swedes and later the British, would continue. As I've told you many times before, the retreating German forces exhibited a particular brutality. This was the case in Belarus, across any occupied territory of the Soviet Union, in Poland, Yugoslavia, and Greece. And France was no exception. On June 10th, an event occurred that would be remembered as the massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane. The commander of a division, a Waffen-SS officer, was informed that resistance fighters were holding a German soldier captive in a nearby village. A battalion from the division surrounded the village and assembled all the inhabitants in the town square under the pretense of checking their documents. The women and children were locked inside the church. The men were led to 6 barns, where machine gunners fired at their legs to prevent them from escaping. Then, the Germans doused the people who were now unable to even crawl away in gasoline and set them on fire. Meanwhile, the church, where 247 women and 205 children were locked inside, was set ablaze. The Germans waited, watching it burn down with everyone inside, before leaving the village. So you might think, all right, the Germans considered Slavs to be subhuman, but these were the French. It makes no difference. There was no distinction. Retreating German forces committed these same atrocities everywhere. On June 14, 1944, the German V-1 rocket saw its first combat use. A year before Germany's surrender, they deployed this weapon for the first time. Nobody else had rockets like this. This was the brainchild of Wernher von Braun, who would later be captured by the Americans and become the founding father of the American rocket program. Their target was London. You've probably seen our episode on the Battle of Britain. If not, it's on the channel. The British had defended their skies and their country against the Luftwaffe, whose campaign hadn't been ultimately effective. But Germany's missile campaign was a different story. It was far more effective. Look at these numbers. By March 29, 1945, in less than a year, the Germans had launched 10,000 missiles towards England. 3,200 landed on English soil. 2,500 of them reached London, killing 6,000 people and injuring nearly 18,000. About 20% of the rockets failed at launch, 25% were destroyed by British aircraft, 17% were shot down by anti-aircraft guns, and 7% were destroyed by barrage balloons. Nevertheless, the effectiveness of the attacks on England skyrocketed, think about this, from 24% to 79%. But of course it was far too late for this to help Germany in any way. All these V-1s, and later the V-2s they launched from the French coast, could no longer influence the outcome of the war in Europe. So, what was happening in the Pacific Theater? There, the Americans continued their slow, grinding advance against the Japanese. For 2 days, from June 12th to the 14th, U.S. forces bombed Saipan. The invasion of the Mariana Islands had begun. On June 15th, 150 amphibious tractors landed the first wave, 8,000 Americans. They were facing a garrison of 31,000 Japanese defenders. So, the Japanese had a significant numerical advantage. However, the Americans had overwhelming firepower, bombarding the island relentlessly from the air and shelling it from their ships. Simply put, the Japanese were in a terrible position. In the first 15 hours of fighting, U.S. losses were 900 men killed and wounded. The Japanese lost 4,500 men killed in that same 15-hour period. Why is the battle for Saipan so significant? First, the Mariana Islands are close to the Japanese home islands. After this, Japan was forced onto the defensive for the remainder of the war. And it was on this island that there is a place now known as Banzai Cliff. What is it? The Japanese warriors were courageous and, in general, merciless, both to the enemy and to themselves. And so, in order not to surrender, they either went to banzai suicide attacks, that is, when, roughly speaking, you have 5 people with rifles there, and you attack tanks or machine guns. The 43rd Japanese Division, under the command of General Yasutsugu Site, went into a banzai attack, and all died. And those Japanese who didn't go to these banzai attacks, they jumped off a cliff to their deaths. And this rock was named Banzai Cliff. These islands were captured. Another, well, rather curious story. 46 Japanese remained alive, and they went into a wooded area, and they stayed there until December 1st, 1945. That is, they sat out 3 months after the surrender of Japan. They tried to make sorties and harm American troops. However, this is not the last soldier of the war. In one of the issues, in the last one, I will tell you about the last soldier of this war. He is also Japanese. He surrendered only in the 60s with the capture of the Mariana Islands. The Americans are only 1,300 miles from Japan, and Imperial Japan understands that the Philippines will really come next. The Americans captured these islands in order to launch an operation to capture the Philippines. From a military standpoint, a weapon was used for the first time here that the Americans would later employ extensively in Vietnam: napalm. They used napalm on Saipan to burn away the jungles, the forested areas, and all manner of Japanese fortifications. On June 19th, the Battle of the Philippine Sea began. This was the last major carrier battle between the American and Japanese fleets. Admiral Ozawa commanded the Japanese carriers, and he was searching for the American fleet. At dawn on June 19th, he sent out seaplanes and reconnaissance aircraft to locate the U.S. ships. They did indeed find the American fleet, and wave after wave of Japanese aircraft. 2 major strikes totaling around 200 to 250 planes began their attack. Why did it happen this way? Honestly, I haven't found a good explanation for it, because the answer was laid bare at Pearl Harbor. Why would you keep hammering the battleships when your primary target should be the aircraft carriers? In this very battle, the Japanese again focused on attacking American battleships. It must be said that they achieved nothing. The Americans put up a massive, incredibly dense wall of anti-aircraft fire, and they also launched every available plane from their own carriers, which began shooting down the Japanese attackers. In the end, only 2 American ships were damaged. In the end, this suicidal attack cost the Japanese virtually their entire operational carrier-based air force. While the air battle raged, a catastrophe was unfolding for the Japanese fleet. An American submarine spotted the flagship carrier, the Taiho, and torpedoed it. It was hit by 1 torpedo. A pilot from one of the Japanese planes actually spotted the second torpedo and saw it accelerating toward the carrier's stern. He deliberately crashed his own plane into the torpedo to destroy it. This is effectively one of the first instances, though not officially the first, and the term kamikaze didn't exist yet, of a pilot sacrificing his own life in such a manner. But it didn't save the carrier. 7 hours later, it sank, and it did so in a rather absurd way. Admiral Ozawa and his staff were barely evacuated in time. The admiral was reportedly screaming that he wouldn't leave the ship because a portrait of the emperor was still on board. A special team had to go back for the imperial portrait before they could evacuate Ozawa. In total, only 500 of the 2,000 crew members were rescued. The rest perished. Later, American aircraft located the remainder of the Japanese fleet. They threw the full might of their carrier air wings, every available plane against the Japanese, sinking another aircraft carrier and a tanker. After this, Admiral Ozawa declared that was enough. They had to end the engagement. He gave the order to quickly save the remaining ships and retreat to Okinawa, toward the Japanese home islands. From that point on, the Japanese carrier force never seriously challenged the Americans again. The Americans in the Battle of the Philippine Sea also suffered significant losses, but in a different way. The U.S. aircraft that had bombed the Japanese fleet then faced a monstrously difficult nighttime landing back on their own carriers. Many planes crashed into the decks of their own ships. Nevertheless, this battle was a crucial and ultimately final blow to the Japanese fleet. Nothing remained of its former power or its carrier air wings. On June 21st, the Soviet offensive against Petrozavodsk began. For a week, the advance progressed successfully. Finnish troops initially put up some resistance, but soon their strength evidently gave out. They hadn't planned to defend Petrozavodsk in the first place, but they had heavily mined the city. On June 28th, the forward units of the Red Army entered Petrozavodsk, and in just 1 week, just think about this, they cleared 5,000 mines. I don't have the exact total statistics, but this gives you an idea of the sheer scale of the operation. The goal of Operation Bagration was the liberation of Belarus and the elimination of the German salient look at the map to see its shape, often called the Belarusian Balcony, where significant German forces remained. The subsequent objectives were to advance into Polish territory on one flank and into the Baltics on the other, effectively splitting the German army groups, encircling them, and destroying them. It must be said that by 1944, Soviet industry, combined with Lend-Lease supplies, completely outstripped the production of any and all armaments in Nazi Germany. Consider this. By the start of Operation Bagration, the Soviet Union held a 23-to-1 advantage in tanks, a 9.5-to-1 advantage in artillery, and a 10.5-to-1 advantage in aircraft. It's important to note that the Germans had been defending the Belarusian Balcony for 9 months, since October 1943, with a relatively small force. Precisely because they had been successfully defending it, they didn't see a need to reinforce the area heavily. They simply did not expect the Soviet Union to amass such an overwhelming mass of men and equipment and unleash its full power upon them. On the other hand, Hitler at this time believed that the most critical territory to defend was France, to prevent the Allies from establishing a foothold on the European continent. Consequently, a portion of the troops from the Eastern Front had been transferred there. And in August, for example, we are now in June, and in August, General Madel will be transferred there, who was used to plug the holes under Leningrad, and during the Belarusian operations, he hastily assembled some defensive fortifications, quite successfully, I must say. And in general, he provided significant resistance to the Soviet forces, and he was transferred there to France, so that he could try to save the remnants of the German troops. Nevertheless, Hitler considered France to be the main direction. This is the third point. It's worth noting that Hitler decided to abandon the concept of defense. Instead, he insisted on protecting fixed geographical locations, which he referred to as fortress cities. These included Minsk, Vitebsk, Bobruisk, and Mogilev. To be honest, I find this concept puzzling, but I believe that simply calling a city a fortress does not make it a fortress. And if you say that a specific location on the map must be held, it is not like holding a group of soldiers. In fact, out of the 12 cities that Hitler declared as fortresses, Soviet forces captured 11 within 3 weeks. The Soviet offensive began with lightning speed. By June 25th, the German 197th, 206th, and 246th Infantry Divisions were already encircled near Vitebsk. Forces of the 3rd Belarusian Front cut the vital railway line running from Orsha westward at Tolokhin, severing a key German logistical artery immediately. The Germans abandoned the city. They had 2 choices: be trapped in the Orsha pocket and face capture or annihilation, or retreat. They chose to retreat. On June 28th, Soviet troops liberated Borisov. Out of the entire corps defending the city, only 200 men managed to fight their way back to German lines. It was clear the Red Army was simply sweeping everything from its path. By the end of the month, both Vitebsk and Orsha were liberated. It was near Orsha, if you recall, that the Katyusha rocket launchers were first used, a topic I covered in one of our earliest episodes on World War II. Further south, Soviet forces crossed the Dnieper River below Mogilev. The city was surrounded on June 27th and stormed on the 28th. On June 29th, the Belarusian front reported to Moscow 33,000 German soldiers and officers had been captured or destroyed. The Bobruisk offensive then began. The push toward Bobruisk in the south started on the 24th. The weather was terrible, which largely grounded the Soviet Air Force. Furthermore, the area around the city was marshy, with poor roads that made it difficult to move heavy equipment. Despite these challenges, the assault on Bobruisk began on June 27th. By the evening of June 28th, the German garrison made a final, desperate attempt to break out of the city. A portion of the Germans managed to escape, but in doing so, they abandoned their entire field hospital, leaving 3,500 of their own wounded behind. By the morning of June 29th, Bobruisk was cleared of German forces. Without pause, the Red Army continued its advance toward Polotsk. By June 29th, Soviet soldiers were approaching Polotsk from three sides. The city's defensive commander, Karl Hilpert, without waiting for orders from the general staff, and despite the city being declared a fortress, Festung, abandoned his post. He effectively deserted the city, fleeing with his staff and the remnants of his forces. On July 4th, Polotsk was fully liberated. While no large pocket was formed, 7,000 German soldiers and officers were captured nonetheless. On June 28th, Hitler dismissed Field Marshal Busch as commander of Army Group Center. He was replaced by Model, whom we know from the Leningrad Front and many other operations in that sector. Model was the architect behind the German defensive fortifications. It was obvious that the German front had collapsed, and their forces were being squeezed near Minsk. At this point, the German command realized a catastrophe was unfolding and began transferring reserves from Europe. They were truly caught between two fronts, one in the Soviet Union and one in France. The German reserves arrived piecemeal and were thrown directly into battle from the march, with no time to rest or organize. They were fed into the fight in fragments, unable to accumulate into a cohesive force. As a result, they could no longer influence the outcome of the battle for Minsk. Furthermore, the remnants of the German Fourth Army. Some 100,000 men were trapped in a pocket near Minsk, doomed to annihilation. Model's presence at the head of Army Group Center could no longer save the situation. After a fierce tank battle on July 3rd, Soviet troops reached the outskirts of Minsk, and by midday on July 3rd, the capital of Belarus was liberated. On July 8th, the German units remaining in the Minsk pocket received the order to surrender. 35,000 men were taken prisoner. 72,000 German soldiers and officers had been killed during the operation. And still, Operation Bagration continued. At the end of the month, on June 29, 1944, a major disaster occurred in the Pacific Theater. The Japanese transport ship Toyama Maru, a large vessel tasked with reinforcing the defense of the Ryukyu Islands, was sailing from Okinawa. It was carrying soldiers, weapons, and barrels of aviation fuel that were stored openly on its decks. It was spotted by the American submarine Sturgeon, which fired a torpedo. The transport ship began to sink. There were 374 people on board: crew, soldiers, civilians, medical personnel, and others. Only 600 were rescued, and that's only according to known Japanese figures. Official Japanese statistics record 5,400 deaths in the sinking. The reality was that saving anyone was nearly impossible. The aviation fuel stored on the decks ignited, the barrels began to detonate, and the fuel created a burning slick on the surface of the water. People in the water were simply burned alive. Rescue attempts were made with aircraft dropping buoys and life rafts, and small boats tried to approach, but it was impossible to save anyone. The death toll reached approximately 5,500, making it the greatest loss of life for a transport ship during the entire war at sea between Japan and the United States. That was June of 1944. On July 1st, a Soviet amphibious operation began to land troops on the islands of the Vyborg Bay. The islands were defended by machine gun nests, mines in the coastal waters, and on the shores, manned primarily by Finnish troops with some German units. On some islands, the landing forces were wiped out within a day. On others, however, they managed to break through the enemy's first line of defense and capture the islands. The strategic objective of liberating the islands in the Vyborg Bay was achieved. In July, operations in the Baltics commenced. On July 5th, the Šiauliai offensive began, lasting for almost the entire month. As a result, Soviet forces advanced between 100 and 400 kilometers on various axes. The crucial outcome was that the German Army Group North was cut off from East Prussia, severely complicating its situation and leading to its eventual destruction over the following months. The Šiauliai operation contributed significantly to the conclusion of the entire Belarusian campaign and marked the beginning of the assault on Prussia itself. Also, on July 5th, another Baltic operation was launched, the Vilnius Offensive. On July 10th, Soviet units entered Vilnius and raised the red banner over Gediminas' tower. German forces continued to resist for another 2 days, until on July 12th, General Stahel ordered the remnants of his troops to abandon the city and fled with his staff and a group of officers. During the battle for the city, 8,000 German soldiers and officers were killed, and another 5,000 were taken prisoner. If you look at the figures from this point on, you'll see German losses beginning to exceed those of the Red Army, with a vast number of prisoners being taken. The Soviet Army, continuing its relentless offensive, was capturing huge numbers of soldiers. I'll tell you more about the fate of these prisoners toward the end of this episode. On July 5th, the Białystok offensive also began. Within 10 days, the front's forces advanced 45 to 60 kilometers, reaching almost the very gates of East Prussia. Białystok itself would be liberated on July 27th. The war was now shifting from the territory of the Soviet Union onto Polish soil. On July 13th, the Lviv-Sandomierz offensive commenced. By the beginning of the operation, we had 100,000 men, 13,000 guns, 2,200 tanks, and 2,800 aircraft at the disposal of our two fronts. Please note that the air, which was won by the Germans in 1941, and in fact, until the end of 1942, they controlled the air, is now, from 1943, especially now in 1944, completely dominated by Soviet aviation. By the end of July 16th, the entire tactical zone of the German defense had been breached by 30 kilometers. On July 17th, the troops of the First Ukrainian Front entered the territory of Polish Silesia. The battles in the Lviv direction were more difficult for the Soviet army, but nevertheless, in both directions, the breakthrough was 80 kilometers wide and up to 200 kilometers deep. Imagine the distances you travel by car, and here they are covered by tanks and soldiers on foot. The Soviet forces cross the western Bua River and encircle a group of 8 divisions, including the infamous SS Division Galicia near Brod. By July 22nd, the group was eliminated, and 30,000 German soldiers were killed, while 17,000 were captured. There were terribly heavy battles in Lviv, and from July 22nd to July 27th, there was a 5-day-long heavy street battle between the garrison in Lviv and the Red Army. It wasn't until July 27th, with the support of Polish partisans, that the Soviet army occupied the cities of Lviv and Przemysl. This led to a conflict with the Poles. The Home Army, which operated as a Polish regular army, was under the control of the Polish government in exile in London. The Home Army is trying to be the first to occupy Lviv and later Warsaw in order to establish a Polish administration there and take these cities out of the control of the Soviet government. Everyone understands that Hitler's Germany will eventually surrender, so they want to ensure that this area does not fall under the influence of the Soviet Union. However, as we will see, the events in Warsaw, especially the uprising, will unfold dramatically, and this will not happen. On July 18th, the Lublin-Brest offensive began, marking the final phase in the liberation of Belarus. By July 21st, the assault group of the First Belarusian Front had reached the western Bug River. On July 22nd, they captured the city of Lublin, while forces on the right flank advanced on Brest. Naturally, Brest was declared a fortress city, Festung. The Germans were terrified of losing Brest. It was the main logistical hub, or as we would say now, a key transportation node. It essentially connected German forces on the Eastern Front with those stationed in Poland and Prussia, making it a vital supply center. The German command rushed the remnants of its 2nd and 9th armies to the area, launching counterattacks in a desperate attempt to prevent Brest from being encircled and to deblockade it. Despite these efforts, the German garrison in Brest was encircled by July 27th. The 28th and 70th armies linked up, and the next day, on July 28th, Brest was taken by storm. After the fall of Brest, the Red Army pushed toward Warsaw. If you look at a map, the distance from Brest to Warsaw isn't that great, though it's one thing to drive it in a car, and another to fight your way there with tanks. By August 4th, the Red Army had forced a crossing of the Vistula River south of Warsaw, establishing crucial bridgeheads near the towns of Magnusu and Puławy. With this, the Soviet army was firmly entrenched on Polish soil. On July 23rd, Pskov was liberated after a very long occupation. Moscow celebrated the city's liberation with a salute of artillery fire. On July 24th, the Narva offensive began. As I've mentioned in several episodes, the Germans under General Model had constructed one of their toughest and most formidable defensive lines in the Narva sector. From July 24th to 30th, forces on the left flank of the Leningrad front launched an offensive with the goal of destroying the German grouping and liberating Narva. At the start of the operation, the defenders from Army Group North consisted of 5 divisions and 2 motorized brigades. The offensive began with an attack by the 8th Army. When the Germans saw that they were also facing support from the Baltic Fleet, they realized their defense would be extremely difficult to maintain. The Red Army forced a crossing of the Narva River and liberated the city of Narva by July 26th. The Germans fell back to their next defensive line, known as the Tannenberg Line. In this operation, the Red Army suffered 4,685 men killed and 18,500 wounded. German losses were 2,500 killed and over 30,000 wounded and captured. Despite the costly victory and the Red Army's subsequent stall at the Tannenberg Line, the city was free. On July 27th, the Red Army entered the city of Grodno. The enemy lost 4 divisions, with 2 additional brigades effectively destroyed. The Białystok operation was now complete. The Red Army had entered northeastern Poland and was alarmingly close to the borders of the Reich itself, East Prussia. It was becoming painfully obvious that the entire Eastern Front was crumbling. Meanwhile, on the French front, the Allied offensive continued. On July 25th, Operation Cobra began the final push to clear the Germans from Normandy. The advance in this region was severely hampered by the bocage. The bocage consists of ancient earthen banks built up by French farmers over decades, even centuries before the war. These hedgerows are massive mounds, overgrown with dense, tangled roots and shrubs, originally planted to protect crops and houses from the sea winds. They created a compartmentalized landscape that was a nightmare for an attacking force. It was incredibly difficult for tanks, armored personnel carriers, and infantry to cross these overgrown, fortified hedgerows. The Americans managed to break through the German defensive lines, entrenched within this bocage, by subjecting the area around the city of St. Lo to a devastating aerial bombardment. By July 25th, U.S. forces had effectively cleared Normandy. The Germans attempted a counterattack, launching Operation Lüttich, but it was defeated. This battle will be the topic of our next episode. By August 21st, some 50,000 to 80,000 German soldiers and officers would be trapped in a tight encirclement, the Falaise Pocket, in western France. Operation Cobra concluded with the complete liberation of Normandy and created the necessary conditions for the invasion of Brittany and, ultimately, the liberation of Paris. To put the losses in perspective, the battle for Normandy was ferocious. Approximately 40 German divisions were destroyed, with total casualties reaching 450,000 men. The Allies lost 210,000 soldiers and officers, including 37,000 killed. As a result of losing Normandy, the Germans were forced into a full-scale retreat from French territory. On July 25th, the battle on the outskirts of Warsaw began. As I mentioned, the Red Army, maintaining a breakneck pace without stopping, burst out of Belarus and reached Warsaw's suburbs. The Germans were desperately trying to establish a defensive line along the Vistula River, but Soviet forces had already forced crossings. This led to a catastrophic breakdown in German logistics. However, the Soviet advance was so rapid that it created a massive crisis in their own supply lines. The offensive units outran their support. Fuel and provisions couldn't keep up. Medical units fell behind. Supply trains became dangerously stretched, and, most critically, the Air Force was left behind. Of course, aircraft are faster than tanks and marching soldiers, but they need forward airfields to operate from. The Soviet Air Force couldn't rebase to airfields closer to Warsaw quickly enough. Consequently, the Soviet troops found themselves practically without air cover. The battle for Warsaw's outskirts began. Just for context, from June 23rd, the Red Army had advanced 500 kilometers. This 500-kilometer blitz march, fought through constant combat, had stretched supply lines to the breaking point and completely disrupted all logistical communications. The German forces in the area, under General Hans von Friedeburg, were consolidated into an ad hoc group named after him. It notably included the Hermann Göring Panzer Division. On July 27th, heavy fighting raged in the suburbs of Warsaw. The Red Army could not advance further because the Germans were constantly launching flank counterattacks. The infantry of Group von Friedeburg did not defend very effectively, and the Red Army was advancing much more successfully on other approaches to Warsaw. In the end, General von Friedeburg himself was captured on July 30th. The units of his group that avoided encirclement fell back north toward Warsaw. This phase of the fighting concluded around August 6th, as it's incredibly difficult to fight without sufficient fuel or air support. The battle continued until about August 10th. In the end, the Germans achieved not a strategic, but a tactical victory. The Red Army reached Warsaw, but could not enter the city itself, halting in its suburbs. It was at this moment that the Warsaw Uprising began in August, and the Red Army was unable to come to its aid, a topic we will cover in the next part. To conclude this episode, I want to tell you about two events that were important mainly from an ideological standpoint, for the immense boost they provided to morale. On July 17th, a March of the Defeated was held in Moscow. Historical legend attributes the idea to Beria, who reported it to Stalin, and Stalin greatly liked the concept. At 11 a.m. on July 17th, columns of 57,600 German prisoners entered Moscow. They marched from the Belorusky railway station along the Leningrad Highway onto Tverskaya Street, then called Gorky Street, past Mayakovskaya metro station, and then proceeded clockwise along the Garden Ring to the Kursky railway station. At the front marched the captured German generals and high-ranking officers, followed by the rank-and-file soldiers. Muscovites lined both sides of the streets, watching the spectacle. My grandmother told me about this parade. She was 16 at the time and saw it all. She said, surprisingly, it was all very quiet. No one threw stones at the soldiers. Of course, some people in the crowd shouted "fascists" and "scum." But overall, the Muscovites reacted with a calm, solemn silence. From the perspective of morale and ideological victory, it was an utterly unimaginable event. These soldiers, these generals, who had wanted to march into Moscow in a victory parade back in 1941, were now being led through its streets as prisoners. According to German memoirs, the rank-and-file soldiers were terrified because they had been fed before the march, which made them think they were being fattened up for execution or a one-way trip to Siberia. Indeed, after the march, these soldiers and officers were loaded onto trains at the Kursky station and sent to POW camps. As the prisoners left the city, the authorities demonstratively sent out water trucks to wash the streets behind them. Officially, of course, they said it was to cleanse the city of the German spirit. But the real reason was much more practical. Tens of thousands of men had marched for hours with no bathroom breaks, and the streets were left in an unsanitary state. The water trucks were, first and foremost, a necessary sanitary measure. A similar parade was later held in Kiev. The second event was perhaps even more significant for morale, or rather, for its collapse. On July 20th, at the Wolf's Lair headquarters, an assassination attempt was made on Hitler by officers from his inner circle. The German High Command was finally realizing the war was lost. The Allies were advancing in Normandy. The Russians were already in Poland. It was time to negotiate for peace. A few German officers were already trying to make contact with the Americans. There were even rumors that Himmler himself was in touch with them. The plotters believed that Hitler, as the most toxic figure, had to be removed, as he was the sole obstacle to surrender, and the only reason the war continued. We have a whole episode on the channel about this event. Please check it out to learn the full story of how the assassination attempt was carried out. In short, Hitler survived. The conspirators were all arrested. Furthermore, the brilliant General Rommel the Desert Fox we've discussed in several episodes was implicated in the plot. He had already been wounded on another front in Normandy, yet he was still accused of being involved. Hitler allowed him to commit suicide by taking poison. He wasn't executed by firing squad or hanged. And that is the story of how the summer of 1944 came to a close.